Okay, hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ariel Perilis, and today I'm happy to share with you our latest release, fresh out of the oven, Dundas BI 4. My job is really made much easier thanks to the many unique innovations produced by our R&D team, and I hope that I'll be able to convey some of that excitement with you today in this session. Just a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is focusing on the new options available starting from Dundas BI 4. So it doesn't cover much of the basics of Dundas BI. If you are completely new to Dundas BI, I'd recommend you watch previous webinars as well or attend one of our demos as an option to get familiar very quickly. This webinar is recorded and will be shared with you following this session, so you will have the chance to review some of the demos later again. In addition, we have a number of options to learn more about Dundas BI 4, including feature series webinar and other options which I'll mention throughout the webinar. And again, at the end, I'll talk about the more advanced options for you to further explore. Finally, please feel free to type in your questions in the webinar questions panel, and we'll do our best to address those during the session. Okay, let's get started. Before we dive into the highlights of Dundas BI 4, I just wanted to be conscious of the fact that some of you are new to Dundas BI, and so I'll start with what drives our product. In fact, it's been a very busy month here at Dundas. Not only we launched Dundas BI 4, but we are also celebrating 25 years of data visualization, business intelligence, and analytics products development. Now, while our product line has evolved substantially, our motto continues to be make 80% of use cases easy and all the rest possible. So this is very evident in our latest platform, Dundas BI, which I'll be showing you today, where common use cases and interactions are all available out of the box, yet a fully open API and deep customizations can be leveraged to extend and further customize the user experience to meet any requirement. So you can really go beyond what a trivial set of options will give you and really customize and adapt to your specific needs. Now, the advantage of Dundas BI is that it combines the best of both the traditional IT-led applications designed typically for enterprise scale solution, that is this left-hand side column on your screen, together with modern data discovery tools designed for business users and a greater focus on ease of use. That is the middle column on the screen. So for example, it provides in a single platform both the ability to run complex data preparation processes and use smart interactive visualizations to analyze it. All of it with the ease of use expected by a model application. Dundas BI offers this combination of capabilities that typically requires multiple tools along with immense flexibility and auto-adapted user experience so more users can get access to valuable data in a way that makes sense to them. Now, Dundas BI 4 is a direct continuation of that positioning. It is designed to provide users with full control of the data in a way that matches their roles and skills. That means that each type of user, ranging from data consumers through to analysts and all the way to administrators and developers, gets more tools to better perform data-related operations and ultimately drive the right actions. Dundas BI 4 is a massive release with over 100 new features, and we group those by types of user roles. So we do recognize many users here may shift and hold multiple roles, and those, of course, will be able to enjoy and benefit across many areas of the application. Now, obviously, today I won't be able to cover all of those new features, but definitely I want to share with you and demo most of those highlights of that new version. And I want to get started with the data consumers and what benefits they would get now with data enrichment capabilities. So as the largest group of users using the application in most organizations and the one that is closest to the business reality, a huge focus for Dundas BI 4 was on enabling data consumers to share their insights without depending on others, without having to wait for IT or other users to help them convey what they know about the business. Now, this includes a series of data enrichment functionalities allowing any user to provide input or feedback directly to the system. Let's take a look at those new options. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to open Dundas BI, and what you can see in front of you, this is a dashboard that we've created in Dundas BI. I'm going to open it in full screen mode. And this is actually a screenshot showing the CNN reporting live broadcasting of the Scottish referendum poll. And as it turned out, they reported 110% for the Scottish independence vote. Obviously, doesn't make a lot of sense. This error quickly became viral on a social network, and Twitter users started mocking the network, and of course was a big embarrassment to the broadcasting team. But those type of errors are actually quite common in the business world. Recent report by Gartner shows that organizations are actually losing almost $10 million a year just on the data accuracy issues. And the real problem with that is that it creates among the business users two types of phenomena. One is a lack of trust in data, which results in users stopping to use the system they actually provide or get data from. And the second problem, which could be even worse, is that users are driven or operating based on the wrong numbers in the system. So in many organizations, to fix that data, we typically require a complex IT process to take place, which can take a while, and oftentimes, by the time that correction is done, the damage is already there or went unnoticed. In Dundas BI 4, what we now give the users, the business users that actually know the data, is the option to control the information and right there on the spot correct it and apply the actual value. So for example, here I'm going to click on control your data, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch to that same dashboard, but right now built into Dundas BI. So it's the same results of the referendum poll. You can see no 52%, yes 58%. And now as a user, I can simply right-click this data point, and I see new options here to correct this value. And if I click on this option, what you can see at the top here is the ability for the user to type in the correct values. I'm going to change this from 58% to 48%. And now very quickly you can see this value corrected in this data point, as well as in related visualization on my dashboard showing that specific data point I just corrected. If I hover over the note mark here, you can see the actual correction that I did. You can see what was the original value I had there before I made that correction, when I had that correction done, and of course other users can come in here and apply their corrections as well, assuming they have the permissions to do so. This is obviously a functionality or with a lot of power, and with great power comes great responsibility. So you want to make sure you open this functionality only to the users that are allowed to correct values and change those in the system. By default, we don't open it up to standard users, only to power users and developers. But if you do have your trust in your organization, if you have that set of business users that know their data and are capable of applying corrections that can help IT close that gap in the source system faster, then that's definitely something we would recommend doing with your users gradually over time. So a very powerful capability. Let's take another example of this option in a more business-related type of context. I'm going to exit this full screen here, and I'm going to create a new metric set. And what I'm going to use here as my data source is simply an Excel file. I'm going to drag and drop onto my screen here. So I have my folder here with my sample data file. So I have here sales by country and time for the previous 4 years. I'm just going to drag and drop this file onto my metric set designer, and this will automatically, of course, establish a connection to my file and allow me to start to analyze and explore the information in this data file. So I can see here sales amounts across different locations and dates. In this case, I only care about the timing, so I'm just going to focus on the date. And what I can see here is the sales across the different days. Now this can be a bit too granular to see any patterns from, so I'm going to easily aggregate and group that data to the year level, just drag and drop my time dimension here, and now I can start seeing that trend at the year level. So far, nothing new to Dundas BI 4. What I can see here is that I had a trend going up all the way to 2015, but then starting from 2015, the value went down in 2016. So I can, of course, right-click this data point and drill down into that specific year and start analyzing the information in that year. And what I can see here is that in 2016, I had a couple of months where I'm missing the data for. So I don't have the data for the month of April. I'm also missing the data for the last month of the year, which is December. Maybe that's because I only closed the books after that day report was generated. So again, how do I correct this value? How do I apply the true representation of my data? So again, not new to Dundas BI 4. I did have the option in 3 and even before, the ability to replace missing data with different rules. So in this case, I can specify how am I going to treat missing data. Can I maybe treat it as a 0 value, or maybe do an average across the different data points of my chart. So that's what I'm going to do here. It's going to apply an average, and now you can see the month of April and the month of December filled up with those numbers. But again, the average is not necessarily the real value, the real representation value of the actual business data. What I can do here is, again, leverage that correction option, right-click, correct this data point, and apply the value I'm familiar with, the value I know that occurred from my sales in the last months of the year. So I'm going to specify here, let's say I had a very good closer of the year for 6 million in sales, apply that, And you can now see your trend, the actual pattern changing very quickly. So not just a single data point corrected, but the actual trend now modified, showing me that the dip that I started having during the summer month was recovered with the closure of the year. So a very different image before I corrected this value and now that I've corrected it. Now, this is a great example of how I can use this capability of data correction, not just to make sure that everybody's working off the right number, which is the first use case I showed you, but in this case to do almost like a small what-if analysis scenario. So I can now tweak with that data correction, change the values, and see how my trend and patterns look like based on the new value I'm inputting into the system. Now this value will not only change the specific trend, but it will also change derived calculations coming from that data point. So for example, if I were to add a formula to this chart, and let's say I want to see the momentum across the different months. So I'm just going to add in here the sales amount, and I'm going to specify 1 month as the momentum spread I want to look at. So basically I want to see the difference month over month and how the trend is changing based on that. And I can see that with the current results I just corrected, the value of my momentum is pretty good. It's finishing on a strong note of the year. But if I were to delete this correction I just applied a few moments ago, what you can see is now my sales momentum looking very, very different with the closure of the year based on the average I just supplement with my missing data. So again, a very powerful way for me to see not just how one data point has changed, but the entire trend and pattern impacted on this series or derived calculations from that data correction. Okay, let's move on to a different type of data enrichment capability we've added to a Dundas BI 4 to help users further contextualize their data. So here's an example of a sales dashboard, and I have different sales metrics across different dimensions. I'm going to focus on the bottom left-hand side here of this dashboard, looking at the average revenue by country. So I can see here the results of revenue by country. I can see the US has the biggest revenue, France has the lowest revenue, but without any context, it's actually quite hard to make a decision around which countries I need to further provide attention to. One way to fix that is to easily go into my data tools and edit this data set into in a full screen mode. So I'm basically going to access the same chart in my metrics designer, and now I can start to analyze it. So for example, I can add a context by going to the properties and exposing a total value across all the different countries on this chart. So once I uncheck this property, you can see a new bar showing me all the countries' results. But again, that may not be the right context if I want to look at the results of individual country. That may be a good context for me to understand if the sales in general is operating as expected. So the next step for me to contextualize this data is to add a contextual measure. Now in previous versions of Dundas BI, you should have probably created that contextual value either using a formula, which would probably be a constant value or some kind of calculation, or provide that new data in your database or somewhere else, maybe an Excel spreadsheet that you blend into your dashboard. But starting from Dundas BI 4, it's very easy now to click on this Add Contextual Measure, which is a very common operations people want to do when they want to contextualize information, and just type in a value here. So I'm going to specify, let's say my target should be 24,400. Apply that, and you can now see a second series added to my chart with that contextual measure, and I can of course modify it. I can say, let's call this thing target, and let's maybe change the aggregation to the average aggregation. And once I apply that, you can now see my chart changing accordingly. But again, that's not very new. I could have done that before with the ability to add a formula and a constant value. What's really new here is the ability to contextualize information, not just with a single constant value across all my categories, but actually doing it in a smart way specifically to each one of my categories. So if you see on the right-hand side, there's a new multiple option. If I click on this multiple option, this will now show me the different contextual values I've added to my chart and will allow me to actually override those values to the individual category level. So for example, for the US, which is my biggest market, I can specify a target of 35,000. And as I change that, you can see the value for the US and for the all changing accordingly. And maybe for Sweden, it should be 18,000 because that's a smaller market for me. So I can easily now contextualize my information at the individual category level without having to work and involve anyone else to bring data into my views. Now at this point, it's quite easy for me to maybe apply states against that value. So I'm going to set up some states, and I'm going to create a good status. And that good status is going to be if my value goes above the target. I'm going to create a bad status as well. And that status is going to be if my value goes below or equal to that target. And once I do that, I can click on this visual button, and you can easily see now all the different countries colored according to the target value. So all the green countries are countries that are operating as expected. All the red ones are the ones that are below target, and I can see all the countries' performance as well. And right now, it's below the targets of all the countries. Now at this point, I don't need this contextual series visible anymore, so I can hide that, focus just on the actual revenue, and use the colors to understand which one is performing well. And I can also use, again, that data correction. So for example, if the UK results are expecting to do better, maybe thanks to the Brexit, I can now right-click, correct this value here, and again, apply a new value, let's say 27,000 for the UK. And you can see this value now updated. The UK is now in a green state, and my all countries are in a green state as well. So I can now combine the contextual measure options with the data corrections and again provide better information for the users operating with this dashboard, trying to understand where they should focus on. And now it's very easy for me to go back to this dashboard and see the results as specified as I've created those in my analysis mode. A third option we've added in Dundas BI for helping users to enrich their data is a new data input transformation, basically helping users to collect data right in Dundas BI. I'll give you an example. In many cases today, when there's a new business initiative, what organizations will do to collect the data for that new business initiative, assuming it's not modeled in their CRM system or in the other operational applications, is just use an Excel spreadsheet. Let's say I have a new sales campaign, and for that sales campaign, I want to track the contact names I've talked to, the level of that contact, and maybe the number of users that the contact organization may have. That process is typically tracked with an Excel spreadsheet or maybe a SharePoint list, so some kind of another data process which is typically manual, typically done in a silo on its own, maybe on some kind of a shared drive that's not very easy to access and share across many different users and is definitely prone to errors. In Dundas BI 4, we're trying to eliminate those data silos and give you the option to centralize information, all of your data right here in this application. So let me go back into the Dundas BI environment. I'm going to create here a new data cube. So for those of you who are new to Dundas BI, the data cube is the data preparation layer of Dundas BI. It's an optional layer, but in case you want to model your data further, you can definitely go in here and create some different types of data models. Typically, in most BI applications, this is done by connecting to existing data sources and then starting to model data on top of that. And that's what we offered till Dundas BI 4. So we had the option to drag and drop data from existing sources or create your own manual query or even generate data from an R script. But starting from Dundas BI 4, you can actually start your data process with your own data input. So I'm going to select this option here. You'll see a new data transformation. And if I open it, you'll see a bunch of columns which are always going to be there for the data input transformation. And here's the option for me to add a different structure. So I'm going to add a new column in here. And I'm going to call this column the contact name. So this is going to be a string. And I'm going to create a new column here. And let's say this is going to be the level of that contact. And one more column, and this will be the number of users for that specific organization. It's going to be an integer. I can specify a default value. In this case, I won't. And if I open the data preview for that data transformation, you can see right now it's empty. That's the structure, but there's no data in it. But very similar to the way you can do it in Excel, I can now easily just type in directly into your browser the actual data points and start collecting that information. So now I can type in a contact name, a level, and the number of users. And if I go into my process results, you can see exactly that specific setup or that specific data I just added to my system. So at a developer level that has access to the DataCube designer, it's very easy to now enter data to the system. But how can I now make it easy for any user, for a standard user, to be able to come in here and add data and collect it right here in Dundas BI? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new dashboard. And as the starting point for this dashboard, I'm going to use that data cube I just created. I'm going to drag in the number of users here. I'm going to drag in here the different dimension, so the contact name and the level. I don't need here the aggregations for the totals. I'm just going to hide that. Also going to make this a flat table. I'm going to quickly change the order of those columns. Perfect. So that's the way I wanted my table to look like. And you can see the exact same table I just created in my data input displayed on my dashboard. Now, as a standard users, you can now go to the data preview menu, and you'll see new options here to modify your data. So if I click on that, again, as I showed you in the data cube designer, any user can come in here and now start typing in values. So for example, I can create a new user here. That will be Chris, and that will be a level 2 user, and Chris has an organization of 400 users. But I can even make it even simpler for the users to input the data. I can actually now use Dundas BI to create a custom web form to collect the information to the application. And I'm doing that simply using the existing controls that Dundas BI offers. For example, a filter control to be able to input some text into my form. So I'm going to use a text box filter here. I'm not going to bind it to any of my dimensions. Just place it here at the top, and I can go into my properties. I'm going to define this as a manual filter because I'm going to type in my own manual values, and I can even hide my token menu right there. I'm going to even provide a name for this. So let's say this is my contact name, and now I have a new text box control allowing me to input the contact name into this table. I'm going to add one more type of filter. In this case, it's going to be a single number filter. Place it right here. Again, hide this token menu, make it slightly smaller, and provide a name for it. This is not the contact, this is the number of users. And one more type of control I'm going to use to input data in here, and that's going to be a component. So not a filter, but just a general component, in this case a drop-down list. I'm going to place it right here in the middle, and I'm going to again go into the properties of that drop-down list and specify the item. So the first item value is going to be level 1. So I'm going to name it level 1. And the second item is going to be level 2. So the value of 2 is going to be the value that I'm going to paste into my form, and the caption for it is going to be level 2. So now I've created all those data input controls that I can use to populate the information to this form. The only thing I need to add now is a submission button to send that whenever I update the information. So I'm going to go to the components, add a button, place it right here, and I'm going to rename that to submit. And what you'll notice with this button now, next to the existing type of setup interactions that I had before Dundas BI 4, you'll see a new type of interactions called data input interaction. So I can easily use that to now decide which visualization or which data input model I'm going to type in data into now using my web form here. So I'm going to choose if I want to refresh a visualization upon submission. In this case, I do want to refresh that, so I'm going to refresh table 1, and I'm going to point the refresh to that data input transformation I just created earlier. So I'm going to specify for the contact names, this is going to be the text box. For the level, this is going to be my drop-down list. For the number of users, this is going to be my numeric parameter. And now, once I've created that, I can easily come in here and start typing in new values. So let's say I'm creating a new user, Ariel, with a value of a level 2 and 500 users. And once I submit that, you can see that new contact added to my table. So in less than 2 minutes, I quickly created web forms, and now on a web-based application, which is where all my data exists, I can now share a new process well to collect information, and of course I can join and merge that with other data models and have that centralized in a single place where all of my BI exists, removing and eliminating those data silos in my organization. Now, all those data enrichment capabilities, of course, are fully governed. There's full control around which user and which group of users will be able to access those capabilities. But as you can see, many different options here available now to the users to be able to easily control and provide new context to your data, enrich your data to make sure everybody's working off the right information and have the right data available to them to take the right action. Moving on to our second area of enhancements, this is an area you can pretty much expect to see in each one of our releases, as visualizations are always at the core of our products. There are many different enhancements out of the visualization, making those even smarter and richer for easy and advanced visual analytics. I want to go through some of those highlights, and I'm going to start with the new visualization recommendation engines. I will mention that there is a webinar specifically dedicated to some of the enhancements around the visualizations coming up in the feature series webinar. So please sign up for that to see many more enhancements around the visualization. But I'm definitely going to focus on some of the key ones here. And again, starting with the visualization recommendation engine. So let's go back to Dundas BI. And I'm going to create here yet again a new metric set. I'm going to focus on a data set here, which I have for US university statistics. So I have some information here about different universities, the earnings, the graduate debt, SAT average, school size, tuition fee, earning after 10 years. This is actually based on real data published by US colleges data sets. So I'm going to choose as starting point my earning value for the different universities. And as I choose that, you can see Dundas BI automatically is showing me that data in a single data point. But starting from Dundas BI 4, what you'll see is as I drag and drop more selections of this data, in this case the earning after 10 years, you can see Dundas BI is going to analyze and go through my data, profile my data to basically understand what's the best way to represent that information. And in this case, it determined that the best way to represent the information is using this bar chart, allowing me to compare the earnings now and the earnings after 10 years. Now, the interesting thing is if you go to the Revisualize menu, you'll see that there is a list of a new category of recommended visualizations. Right now, it's recommending to either visualize this in a bar chart, which is what it shows by default, or a point chart, or a bullet graph. Of course, I can still access all the other type of visualization I always had up until this version, but definitely it's much easier for me now to use that automatic selection as well as the recommendations to better find insights I couldn't necessarily see easily before with a single display of the data that forced me to go and look for other types of visualization that could potentially suit that data display. Now, as I keep on dragging more and more selection on this data, as I mentioned, it will automatically find the best visual for it. So I drag and drop the university here. Now it broke it down into a scatter plot, showing me a different point for each university, and then the earnings on the left-hand side, and on the bottom axis, I can see the earnings after 10 years. And if I open the Visualize menu now, you can see that there's a different list of recommendations for that type of data set now. And what you can see is that beyond the different chart types, such as a scatter plot, data bar, table, and tree map, you can also see it's providing me some smart visualization that typically require calculations, but in this case, Dundas BI has profile data and understood that this type of calculations can be done for you very easily in a single click and would match your data set. So for example, it can calculate for me the box plots for that data set, or it can go in and add a trend line to see the correlation between those two measurements. So if I choose that, you can now see those two measurements obviously correlate very well as expected. So I can maybe remove that. And what I can also do is I can again switch to any other type of visuals I want, even if it's outside the recommended list. And if I were to do that, if I were to select, for example, the point chart, as I drag and drop additional measurements such as the graduate debt or the tuition fee, you can see that it's going to be still using that selection that I made. So it's not going to keep on changing the visualization for me once I made a selection about the way I want to visualize my information, in this case using this point chart. So very powerful in the way that I can work with this data, either start and have the system recommend the best visualization for me, or if I know exactly what I want, just choose the right type of visualization and have the system keep on populating this chart with that pre-selected type of visualization. Now again, if I open this Revisualize menu, you'll see that the list of recommended visualization is changing again, and now I can see even two new types of visualization that can be suitable for this type of data selection. In this case, I have at least 4 measurements, so I can now see a new type of visualization called the parallel coordinates chart. So let me open that type of visualization. I'm going to open a dashboard using this very same data set with the universities and the earnings and the graduate debt, SAT averages, and all those different types of measurements. And what I can see that Dundas BI created for me in that single click is that chart below it showing me on the bottom axis the different measurements. So it's not a time-based line chart. It's just a line for each one of those universities showing across those different measurements normalized to 100%. So you can actually see the percentage value against the rest of the universities. And what this type of visuals allow me to do is quickly focus on different universities and see how they behave, how similar they are comparing to the rest of the university in that specific category, in that specific measurement I'm looking at. So very powerful to look at a lot of data points at the same time and see how close I am in terms of the pattern or the stack of the rest of the universities for that specific selection I have. You can see it as I'm hovering over the different universities, it's going to brush and show the right series at the bottom chart, that parallel coordinates chart. One more type of new visualization that is available with our recommendation engine, I'm going to create actually in a new dashboard, is the correlation metrics. So again, if I have multiple measurements available in my data, so let me search for a data set I prepared here. This is the Motor Trend Cars data set that contains different measurements such as the number of cylinders I have in the car, the number of gears, horsepower, miles per gallon, transmission, weight, and so on. So I can now easily just drag and drop those different measurements into my dashboard that was always there before. Nothing new so far. I'm going to quickly drag and drop those and add them into my table here. And I'm going to break it down by the different car models. Okay, so I've created a similar table to the one I had on the parallel coordinate chart with the different measurements and the different car models. And if I go into my revisualize menu now, what you can see here in the recommendation is that correlation metric type of visual. And if I select this one, what you can see is that in a single click, Dundas BI went in and calculated the correlation between all those different measurements. On the diagonal here, what you can see is the measurement correlation to itself. So that's always going to be that deep blue showing a perfect correlation. So the deeper the blue is, the better the correlation is. The darker the red is, the more negative the correlation is. And the lighter the color is, that means that there's very little correlation between those two different measurements. So it's a great way, it's a great visualization for me to now be able to analyze which type of those measurements have some kind of a hidden relationship, hidden correlation I wouldn't necessarily think about. Now, some of those are very obvious. For example, the weight has a negative correlation with the miles per gallon. Obviously, the heavier the car is, the more miles per gallon I'll be spending. But I can see here's some correlation I didn't necessarily expect. So for example, if I look at the transmission and the weight, there's actually a pretty negative correlation between the two, which I didn't necessarily expect. I mean, automatic transmissions and manual transmission are probably not that different in their weight. So this is a good point for me to start investigating why is the automatic transmission has a negative correlation on the weight. Why are the automatic transmission cars heavier than the cars with manual transmission? And maybe one explanation for that is that typically manual transmission cars are cheaper than automated transitions, cars with automatic transmissions, and the reasons for that is because they are typically less featured than cars with automatic transmissions, and those type of features, such as maybe heavier wheels or additional functionalities to your car, is what typically drives the additional weight to the car, which makes it heavier than the cars with manual gears or manual transmission. So definitely interesting type of correlation I wouldn't necessarily think about without having that visual that prompts me to start asking that specific question. So that's the recommendation engine and different types of calculated visualization we've added to it to make it easier for you to go into deeper analysis using those type of visualizations. And again, all done with a single click without having to go through data prep and calculations on top of your different measurements. Now, in addition to those type of visualizations that we've added to the recommendation engines, we also added new type of visualization to our general list of visualizations. And that is specifically under the family of the relationship visualization that we've started adding in Dundas BI 3. So I'm going to, again, use an existing data structure here, and I'm going to focus on my Formula 1 budget for 2015. So here I have my total value, and I'm going to break it down by the source value. So you can see here how my budget was broken by the operations, productions, R&D, and I want to see how under each one of those categories it's break down further. So I'm going to drag in the target, and I can see that under the operations I had spending under entertainment for that amount, and for a fuel for that amount, and IT and logistics and so on. Same with each one of the other categories. But what's hard for me to see in this table is the nested categories. So for example, key components appear on a category on its own because it has its own breakdown. But it's actually a subcategory under the production category. That's where the key components really belongs. With this type of visual, it's hard for me to see that type of a flow of the data of the budget. Now, if I were to revisualize this data set into that new type of visualization called Sankey diagram, again, under that relationship family, and I go into the visualization binding and I now specify I have a source and a target here. That's my flow. I can now see the way my budget actually flows through the different channels. So I can see that's my original breakdown: operations, productions, R&D, and salaries. And then under the production, I have a branch here that goes to the key components that then branches into those different categories on its own. And then the rest of the production categories, such as the customer engine supply and manufacturing. So a great visual to actually see the flow of the data. It can be used for visualizing money flow, like in this case, or energy retention or material consumption in that very schematic way. There's another way also for me to use this maybe with data which is by default defined as hierarchies data. So I'm going to open an existing metrics that I have here. And in this existing data set, I have two different hierarchies. I have my product categories hierarchies and my date hierarchy. And what I can see here is the top level of the hierarchy. So I can see my breakdown of the sales across accessories, bikes, clothing, and components. I can see the bikes is the heaviest channel in that sales amount. So I can now right-click that channel and just expand it. And now I can see this breaking the flow into 3 different categories: mountain bikes, road bikes, and touring bikes. And I can do the same right here on the date category. So again, right-click, expand, and use those different types of interaction to really see the way my sales flow throughout those different types of combinations. So a very neat way to go about visualizing different processes flow. The last enhancement I'm going to show you today around the smarter visualizations or new types of visualization that we've added in Dundas BI 4 is a new way to democratize how users can go in and actually represent and visualize complex processes and the performance of those processes. So up until Dundas BI 4, you did have the option to create your own diagrams, drag and drop them into a Dundas BI, and visualize those diagrams by binding them to data. But the creation of those diagrams was typically quite complex and usually required a graphic artist or a technical user that's very capable of creating those complex diagrams. Starting from Dundas BI 4, what you can do now is you can actually use your favorite application to create SVG file. For example, if you're familiar with Visio, it's a great tool that you can use to actually generate different type of diagrams. So in this case, I've created production process diagrams just by dragging and dropping different elements, different shapes from Visio, similar to the way I'll be doing it in PowerPoint or any other type of Office application. And in Visio, I can now go in here and create a name for those specific elements in my diagram. So for example, I can say this specific step, I'm going to define the data for that shape, and I'm going to name this as the packaging step. That's all I need to do. Just create my diagram in Visio. Any user can do that, and then save this file as an SVG file. So I can just maybe save that on my desktop, change that to SVG, and then you can see here I already saved that production process diagram right in here. And once I do that, I can now go back into Dundas BI. I'll create a new dashboard, and let me drag and drop here from my desktop that production process diagram. So I'm going to drag and drop into my Explore panel here, and I already did a couple of times. I have that production process diagram right in here, and I can just drag and drop that onto my dashboard and see that same diagram I created in Visio, but right now it's stripped of colors. There's no colors defined for it. The idea is that the colors will be populated from the data. So here I'll go back into my data sets, and I can see here I have my production process data set. If I drag and drop that onto my dashboard, you can see here a table showing me the different steps of my production process: manufacturing, quality assurance, and packaging, and then the status for those different steps. So I can see manufacturing and packaging are in a perfect status, but my quality assurance is down right now. Something is happening around that step. If I were to drag and drop that data set onto my diagram, you can see Dundas BI will automatically now bind this data according to those different step names and allow me to visualize the current status. Right now it's using those darker blues and the light blue to define different states, but I can of course control that and maybe have a dark red in case the quality assurance process is down. So a great way to help users understand the information, instead of having to go and read through a table and understand how the different operation sets are performing, just view it visually and quickly understand where the flow is breaking. So very powerful in terms of visualizing complex processes performance. Okay, so switching gears here, let's move to a data analyst, and these are the users that are mostly in charge of authoring enterprise-level content, such as data models that we call data cubes in Dundas BI, or pixel-perfect reports. Now, if you are a content creator working on those, you'll enjoy now, starting from Dundas BI 4, faster ways to develop and standardize work that started as maybe a quick and dirty proof of concept, and then became a mission critical or kind of an enterprise level solution that needs to be modeled and treated accordingly. So we call this functionality rewiring, and that's available at different levels of the application. I'll be demoing that in a moment. In addition to the rewiring functionality, there's also a lot of enhancements to our multi-page report designer. I won't cover those today, but these will be covered extensively under our operational reports feature series webinar next week. So let's start by taking a look at the new rewiring option. So I'm going to go back again to Dundas BI, and I'm going to tie this back to what I started showing you earlier under the standard users and their ability to now collect and store data in the application with the data input functionality. So if you remember, I did mention that the data input process doesn't have to start with a data cube designed by a developer. It can actually be initiated by a standard user as well, or a power user. So in this case, under the metric set level as a power user, I can come in here and instead of exploring data from a new connection I'll create or an existing data structure, I can just start exploring data by entering it right into the system. So I'm going to use this enter new data. And similar to the way I did earlier in the data cube designer, I can now input this data right in here. So I can say my structure for this data is going to be a product column and just provide the values very similar to the way I showed you earlier. Let's say product A. And maybe I'm going to add another column in here, and that column is going to be the sales for that product. So this is going to be a number, and the sales for that product are maybe going to be, let's say, 2,000. So you can now see I'm quickly able to add data and easily visualize it in the system without having to define it or create it in a different application. Just right in here. And of course, I can revisualize it to any type of visualization that works for me based on my selection, similar to any other type of a data source I'll be working with. So I can quickly create a small example here, different values, and that's maybe a real representation or maybe a fake representation of my data just to mock up the way it's going to be displayed in my dashboard. Now, once I've defined that, instead of having to recreate that from a real data source, Dundas BI is also a real data source, but from an actual application database or maybe a separate data source, instead of having to recreate that visual, there's a new option here under the metric set called Replace Source Cube. And if I click on that, I can now go in here and choose any other data models to replace that specific data structure I created right here. So let me switch projects here and go to a different enterprise level project where I've defined different data models that works better for that structure. So for example, here I have by revenue by product. And if I choose that, Dundas BI will prompt me to rewire that source cube, the one I just created here with the product and sales column, to the new fields available from the new data source I want to map to. So maybe I'm moving from that data input I just created in Dundas BI to a Google BigQuery data source, or to a SQL Server database. So for example, here I'm going to map the product to this queue. I'm going to map the sales to my revenue. And as I do that, you can now see Dundas BI automatically replacing this data, populating it with the real data from my real source. So a very quick way to leverage existing prototypes or work you started creating by rewiring your data either at the metric set level or even at the data cube level, in charge of many different types of metric set, by replacing that and pointing it to a different data source. We often see our users developing those proof of concept based on Excel spreadsheets or other easy data sources they create, not just by creating it in the application. These as well can be replaced with any other type of data source as long as you have compatible data types in your data structures. Okay, the last group of new options, and that's geared towards better and easier integration, is not going to be displayed in any particular order. There are many additions here enabling to really seamlessly deploy Dundas BI within other applications or together with existing systems. It starts with a new native big data analytical databases data connectors that we offer in Dundas BI 4 now, such as the HP Vertica and the XSL data connectors. And it continues with new online and offline methods, making Dundas BI even easier to access. So the first method I'll be showing here is what we call report bursting. If you're not familiar with report bursting, it's basically a great way to now distribute and diffuse your dashboards with many different types of users, but in an individual way. What do I mean by that? So always, starting from version 1 of Dundas BI, we had the option to schedule and distribute a dashboard or a report with many different users. So you can define a delivery that will be sending an email once a week or once a day to different types of users. But up until this version, the email was the same email sent to all the users. But what if you want to contextualize that email and make it individual to each one of the users? For example, think of your electricity bill. You're not getting the same electricity bill that your neighbor is getting. How can you do that now in Dundas BI? So starting from version 4, you do have an option here to separate the email per recipient. And if you check that, it's going to be a new checkbox showing me the option to export this dashboard report using the recipient account, which is typically what you want to have. So if your recipient account, if the different accounts you have in the system have some kind of a custom attribute or a value defining what data they can see, the email that will be generated with the report attached to the email for those users will be generated in that context of that account. Alternatively, you can also define in here what each one of the users will be getting. So for example, for myself, I can specify and customize a parameter and say that the employees I should be getting the emails for are just Drew and Gary, which are the employees I'm managing. And maybe if I add another recipient to my email delivery here, let's say I'm going to add Rob here. And for Rob, I'm going to say Rob should get that same report, but just filtered on Jen and Lars instead of Drew and Gary. And once I do that, I basically created a single delivery, a single report that's going to distribute that same dashboard to myself and to Rob, but the report export that will be attached to the email will be contextualized and individualized to that specific user. So that's a report bursting, a great way to spread a lot of to access a lot of users with a single delivery defined. Other options we've added around integration is the ability to make that integration much easier into other web applications. So if I open some of my integration demos here, I have a new example here that shows me how I can embed Dundas BI within other applications very, very easily. So we do that using what we call the embed library. We've created an embed library allowing you to easily reference a single script, that embed library script right here, and then add a div to your HTML page. And this is again a bit more technical, but add a simple div to your web page referencing this class, and then the server of Dundas BI, the type of view you want to integrate, and then the ID of that view. So once you do that, you can simply click on this run button, and you'll see how I've integrated very easily Dundas BI, a dashboard from Dundas BI in my web application. And of course, I can experiment with that right here, so I can see if I change the different variables, how will that affect the way the integrated application will look into my own application. So very, very easy to now integrate and publish Dundas BI within other applications without writing almost any code, just simple HTML. Another type of addition we added to the integration is what we call federated claims-based authentication, which is basically the ability to provide a single sign-on experience with common federated authentication protocols such as SAML, OpenID Connect, or AWS Federation. So what do we mean by that? If you want to authenticate to Dundas BI up until version 4, basically you had 3 different options. You can either use the built-in local users you've defined in the system. You could authenticate based on Active Directory, or you could have used the web developer to create a custom account provider and authenticate against a third-party user base that they will be used to authenticate to Dundas BI. Starting from this version with the federated claims-based authentication, you can now reference known identity providers that will be handling the authentication and the user management. For example, think of Gmail accounts or Facebook. You can now very easily authenticate against those users, and using the authentication bridge that we've added in version 4, able to understand if the user is allowed or not allowed to access the system. Again, leaving all the user management to Gmail, Facebook, or any other one of those protocols I mentioned earlier. So very quickly, I'm going to show you an example for that as well. I'm going to go into my administration settings here. I'm going to open the account service and show you the list of accounts I have in this system. And right now, the list of accounts contains only local user accounts. So all of those users are users I've manually defined as an administrator in the system. What I'm going to do in here, I'm going to go into the setup, and under the config option, I'm simply going to open the category configurations, and I'm going to change here the custom login URLs. There's a bunch of configurations I need to apply here. Again, this will be demonstrated in details in the feature series webinar about integration, but what I'm going to show you here is the option to quickly configure an authentication bridge that will point me to my Google provider. So I'm going to use Gmail accounts to basically, or Google accounts to basically authenticate to Dundas BI. So once I do that, I can open here a new window. I'm going to open a new window here, and I'm going to specify the URL of the application. And you can see I've typed in the URL for my server, but this actually took me to the Google login page. Right in here, I can log in using my Google account, same way I would log into any other it helps if you can spell Gmail properly. And right here, I'm going to type in the password. And once I log into Gmail, what this will do, this will actually take me back to Dundas BI and create a new account for me, in this case a standard user, using my Gmail credentials. And just so you can see, I didn't cheat here. I'm going to go back to the accounts users, and you can see here there's a new type of user, an external user created, showing me that account coming from the Gmail authentication or the Google authentication. So I have a couple of modes for this. I can allow users to connect only if I predefine them, or I can allow them to be created here on the fly with that new authentication if they didn't exist before. But basically, very powerful way for me now to integrate with existing authentication methods that already exist out there without having to create a custom account provider or having to replicate those accounts in my local user system of Dundas BI. Okay, so that covers the extended integration. Again, much more on the embed library and the federated claims authentication in the feature series webinar in a couple of weeks. So what's next for us? As you can imagine, you can expect to see much more investments in Dundas BI, mostly around making sure data can be easily understood and manipulated to serve all needs. We're going to keep on focusing on making sure that it's easy to integrate and embed, as well as visually analyze the information. And finally, of course, we'll make sure that our mutual loyalty with our customers will continue to drive our development. Definitely work very, very closely with you, making sure that whatever matters to you is possible and easy to do in Dundas BI. What's next for you? If you want to learn more about Dundas BI 4, I strongly recommend you sign up to the feature series webinars I mentioned. They'll be starting next week. You can easily do that from our website. In addition, you can also get a personal demo or talk to your account executive and solution architect and better understand how Dundas BI 4 can help your specific environment. If you're new to Dundas BI, or if you're an existing customer that already want to upgrade, you can easily download it right now from our support site, or as a new customer, just sign up to a trial or download and experiment it yourself. So hopefully that was an interesting overview for you guys, and you share some of the excitement that we have with Dundas BI 4. At this point, what I want to do is I want to start taking the different questions that you've posted throughout the webinar. If there's more questions that comes up, or if you didn't ask your question so far, please feel free to open the GoToWebinar panel and type in your question, and I'll try to address those as much as possible in the remaining few minutes. Okay, so the first question here is around the write-back capability that I showed at the beginning under the data enrichments options for the standard user. So there's a couple of options I showed. One was the ability to correct the information, and one was the ability to collect the information with the data input. And the question here is, does the data get written back to the source? And the answer for that is no. We do not correct or change the information at the source database. That could be very dangerous. We don't do that by default. So the correction is actually, as you could have seen earlier, is stored in the application database of Dundas BI and is displayed along with the original value from the source. That being said, with the API, you can easily interfere and change that correction to go back and change your source. But again, that will require an even greater level of trust between the IT and the business, which is something that typically builds over time. So by default, that's not the way that the correction will work. The second question around that is, what user level could perform this function of data correction? And the answer to that is all types of users could potentially perform this function. The default setting is that standard users cannot correct values, and power users and developers can. That being said, it's an easy property in the administration of Dundas BI to change that permission at the group level or at the individual user level, and allow standard users to be able to correct or deny power users from being able to correct values. Okay, I have a question here around the embedded sample I just demonstrated, and how was the user security handled in the example I was showing. Let me go back to that example just so it's clear. In this example, I was launching here a Dundas BI dashboard in my application, and as you can see in the properties here, I don't have any property that actually handles the security, the authentication to that specific dashboard. In this case, what I'm launching here is actually a dashboard on our samples gallery. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to see that exact same dashboard. And the way the authentication and security for this dashboard is handled is using what's called the anonymous login account, which is a specific account that you can configure in Dundas BI, designed specifically for environments where you want to open dashboards to any users just as a live access to data. So in this specific case, because my samples gallery is configured to use anonymous login, I didn't have to configure what the security I want to handle to authenticate to this dashboard. I do have, as part of the embed library, options to configure the security as well, and that will be covered, as mentioned, in great details in the next 2 weeks under the Integration Feature Series webinar. Okay, so there's a question here about is there a limit to the number of data visualization, especially around the number of combinations of dimensions that you can have on a dashboard? The question that is no. There's no limit to the combinations of measures and dimensions. Obviously, at some point, depending on the type of visualization you use, it could not make sense. So, for example, if you're using a point chart and you start adding too many dimensions, you'll start losing the context of what each data point means very, very quickly. That being said, there shouldn't be any limit. The only limit is really the ability of the server to query the information from your data sources. If your data source is capable of providing back the number of measures and dimensions combinations that you queried, or the data model that you've designed is capable of providing that, Dundas BI will be able to easily visualize that. Okay, so there's a question here about the single sign-on, and the question here is not so much about the new federated client specification. It's more about Windows Active Directory authentication, and is around the ability of Dundas BI to support cross-domain authentication. So if the user sits in domain X and Dundas BI is hosting in domain Y, can we enable that type of a single sign-on? And the answer to that is yes. In Dundas BI 4, we even added support for Active Directory Forest as well. So definitely that type of authentication can be handled as well in Dundas BI. So there's a question here, is it possible to full screen particular chart on a dashboard? And then if you minimize, go back to the dashboard. So I actually demonstrated a little bit of that earlier in one of my examples. Let me open up that dashboard again. So I had an example here showing how I could look at different charts. So if I right click here, go to my data tools, I can edit this in full screen mode. So this will take me to full screen mode about this chart. And then if I click on back to dashboard, this will take me obviously back to the dashboard as expected. So yeah, there is an option to go to full screen on a particular chart on the dashboard and then not click minimize, but go back to your dashboard. Another question about can I pass parameters to embed reports to filter the content? So I guess that that relates again to this sample I was showing here, how I can use the embed library to embed content in another web application. And the answer to that is absolutely. Again, that example will also be demonstrated in the next 2 weeks in the feature series webinar about integration. There's of course already documentation available to you, so you can read about the embed library and read about how to do it. But the answer is yes, you can absolutely pass parameters as well to filter the information of the embedded content. The next question is around the ability to send emails. So if I specify a new schedule notification that delivers email, what level of access is required to do so? And the answer is any user in Dundas BI by default is allowed to set up a notification. Again, like any other option in Dundas BI, you can turn it on and off as an administrator based on the user or the groups of users, so you don't have to allow users to be able to set up those emails. In terms of the permissions at the server side to access the mail server, that's just a configuration you apply once in the configure options of Dundas BI. So that can be done regardless of the user that's setting up the emails in the application. Okay, one last question that I'll have time to answer here, and I apologize if a number of questions that I didn't have time to answer, but we are coming up to the top of the hour. I will get back to all of those questions via email. We will get back to you via email afterwards. And if we didn't address those, please feel free to reach out to us at info@dallas.com or directly to a account executive if you're already in touch with an account executive. And that question is around the ability to use real-time high-frequency data sources, and is it still possible to refresh to control the refresh rate on data coming from sources? It's still definitely possible. We didn't remove any capabilities of Dundas BI 4. Similar to the way you were able to do it before Dundas BI 4, you can still do it in this version. Basically control the data auto refresh interval property, which is in second, and then specify how often do you want to refresh the information from the source based on that frequency. So hopefully that they answered that specific questions. I do want to thank you all for joining the webinar today. I am looking forward to see your feedback and how you use Dundas BI 4. I know all the beta testers are really excited about it, and definitely looking forward to see your feedback as well now with the general availability release. Thank you again, and have a good day. Bye-bye.